Hi, everyone. My name is Ben Moraine. I'm the Executive Director here at the New Israel Fund of Canada. Thank you all for joining this presentation about Tisha B'Av and present-day Jerusalem. This is a day where we are committed to self-reflection on the topic of hate. We're going to do a few things today. But first, I'd like to have a little bit of a word from a couple of the other organizations that have generously co-sponsored this important conversation. After we have a couple of them speak, we're going to do a little bit of getting to know more about this holiday, its themes, some texts that relate to what it is that we're supposed to be doing and why it relates to the work that our partners overseas are doing. And then we're going to hear from Alon Arad, who does some of the work that we're talking about in Jerusalem today.
Want it all the way down,
and then we'll get to some Q&A as well.
Yeah.
Let's make sure to mute ourselves. For those who don't know, the New Israel Fund of Canada is the largest organization devoted to democracy and equality in Israel by funding and supporting Israelis, Israeli institutions on the ground that are fighting for social justice, for civil and human rights, for religious freedom, for Palestinian citizens' equality, for Jewish-Arab shared society and anti-racism of all kinds, and for democracy itself in Israel. We're joined in this work by many organizations here in Canada and on the ground. We accomplish our work by supporting not only organizations on the ground, but the New Israel Fund conducts its own capacity building, its own advocacy in Israel on the ground. And the topic of Jerusalem obviously is a significant one that comes up for us frequently. For decades, the New Israel Fund has been investing in organizations that seek to make Jerusalem a fairer, more equitable place, ultimately a shared capital between two nations, and a multicultural capital that has had within it, centuries, millennia of different civilizations. And part of our conversation today is how do we surface that work? How do we maintain a Jewish connection? What is the significance of a Jewish connection to that place when other people have lived there before, during, after, and then during again while we were there, as well as people who presently share that city with us also. Before we get into all of that, I'd like to introduce Lee Weiser of ARZA Canada to share a little bit about their work and their relationship to this issue. And then also after Lee, I'd like to introduce Tamara Salpeter of Canadian Friends of Peace Now. Both of these organizations, as well as Shari Bethel Congregation of Halton, have joined as co-sponsors of this event, helped us get out the word. Thank you so very much. Lee?
Thank you, Ben. I am honored to be the president of ARZA Canada, which is the Zionist voice of the reform movement in Canada. We work to connect our 25 congregations and their members to Israel in a variety of ways through educational programs and through sponsorships. We also support the Israel Movement for Reform and Progressive Judaism, which has over 50 congregations in Israel. In addition, part of the reform movement in Israel is the Israel Religious Action Center, which is a beneficiary of funds from the New Israel Fund. And the Israel Religious Action Center fights for equality and pluralism and fights against racism in Israel. And we're very proud to be connected with them. On a personal note, I am really interested in today's program, as it is a time of reflection. I love Jerusalem, and also my heart breaks for Jerusalem, for what it could be. And I really appreciate this opportunity. Thank you.
Thanks, Lee. Tamara?
Hello, everyone. I'm a board member of Canadian Friends for Peace Now, for Canadian Friends of Peace Now. On behalf of our board, I'd like to thank the New Israel Fund of Canada for hosting this important discussion, as well as Alon for being here. Canadian Friends of Peace Now is a partner organization to Peace Now, known as Shalom Achshav in Hebrew. This is Israel's premier peace movement, and it was founded in 1978. Peace Now speaks out tirelessly against the folly and injustice of a permanent Israel occupation of the West Bank. We call for a resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict through a negotiated two-state solution. Shalom Achshav's flagship program is Settlement Watch, which monitors, exposes, and protests and works against the spread of Jewish settlements in the West Bank. One of the most insidious aspects of the settler enterprise is its operations in Jerusalem. For decades, settler groups have been trying to create Jewish enclaves in East Jerusalem and to oust Palestinian residents from their homes there. Peace Now has stood together with the Palestinian residents against these actions. Peace Now vigorously protests the mindset of right-wing extremists that says all of Jerusalem belongs to the Jews and must be exclusively under the rule of the Jews. We believe this city, holy to three world religions, must be creatively shared. But instead of being a city of peace, Jerusalem is often a hotbed of tensions. This is especially so during religious holidays, whether Israeli or Palestinian. So today's webinar, coming in the wake of Tisha B'Av, is very timely. It's very timely too, because we have just witnessed another tragic flare-up of violence between Israel and Gaza. Thankfully, the clashes did not spill over into Jerusalem this time, but it could have happened. Please keep in mind that Jerusalem is central to any future peace agreement between Israelis and Palestinians. So I'm really looking forward to what our speaker, Alon Arad, will tell us about a more constructive way of looking at Jewish heritage in Jerusalem. And you can find out more about Canadian Friends of Peace Now at our website, which is peacenowcanada.org. You can look in the chat. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Tamara and Lee. For those of you in the chat who picked up on this, yes, we do begin with a land acknowledgement. So at this point, I'd like to acknowledge that here in Toronto, I'm on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And this is also now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I also want to acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Those of you who are joining from elsewhere in Canada and therefore sit on different Indigenous territory, I encourage you to take a moment to reflect and acknowledge this wherever you are. At this moment, I'd like to introduce our first bit of teaching. What is this holiday? What does it mean? Where does it come from? And what are some of the ways that we can connect it to what is happening in Jerusalem today? I'd like to introduce Devon Spier. Devon is a rabbinical student at the Academy for Jewish Religion and is queer and non-binary. She's taught at J Street, and her work has been used by the London School for Jewish Studies, the National Havurah Committee, and she's been published interdenominationally in CCAR, Reconstructing Judaism, Ben Yehuda Press. Devon is the author of 2 books, Heart Map and the Song of Our Ancestors, as well as Whatever It Is, Gently, a book of pandemic poems. She's also a designer and curates Jewish Designs, the irreverent online art depot. We're delighted to have you with us, Devon. Would you please teach us a little bit about what this day involves?
I want to start off by saying I'm so grateful to Ben and Hannah and the New Israel Fund of Canada, Canadian Friends of Peace Now, Ours of Canada, and my former congregation for a period when I was a small person, Sharei Bethel, for allowing me the opportunity to teach, but especially to be with you all today. And Alon, I'm blessed to learn from you and your principled work and presence with Emek Shaveh on the ground. Thank you from my heart for your holy trouble. Tisha B'Av, which just passed, is a time of holy remembrance, grieving, and acknowledgement of the vast destruction of the Second Temple and of Jerusalem proper that tore apart the Jewish people in the year 70 CE. And there's this word that follows us around during this entire month of mourning. We find it on Rosh Chodesh and Haftarah and the very beginning of the Book of Lamentations. And it's this word how, very simple word. How, echa, how could this possibly happen? But we do know some facts on the ground in this year of catastrophe. We know that hunger and carnage was so pervasive, literally, you could not see your feet if you were walking through the streets or a marketplace because bodies lined every Jerusalem stone. And we also know that the hunger was so severe, and this is unimaginable, it really is. The family members were forced to eat their children out of such lack. It's unthinkable. And this isn't midrash or imaginative telling. This is transmitted in Tanakh. At least a fifth to a quarter of the population did not survive. Deathly anguish, rinse, repeat cycle of mourning, our generational laundry again and again. And I'll admit to all of you today, I have to resist the temptation, like Groucho Marx dancing the Charleston on Hitler's grave, to try and dissuade you all from how we can live so comfortably in the midst of seemingly endless destruction and perpetual mourning without once turning back to glimpse and at least reconsider ourselves. At what point does the conversational anesthetic wear off and words like occupation, right-wing nationalism, and settlements become pablum? Where do we the apathetically anguish, perhaps gazing over our navels a bit at this week's next endless cycle of generational violence in the Holy Land? Where do we go from here? And it was in the midst of this routine haze that the source material, the kina or the dirge, from the verb koneh, to sing a dirge, came to me. And I decided this would be what we could study, just as HaKadosh Baruch Hu came to me, the source of life. So these two sources called to me in this place, in this haze. And I'm going to ask Hannah right now to post the kina or dirge we're going to analyze in the chat. And I want to tell you a little bit about what this is. So this is an original poem authored by the poet Rebbe Elazar ben Kalir, and it's translated by Rachel Salston, who's a Soferet at the Ziegler School for Rabbinic Studies, to whom all credit is due. And I brought this dirge to you for two reasons. First of all, this is an example of many dirges that are incorporated into the Amidah, in particular the Yerushalayim Ircha section of the prayer, which asks God to rebuild Jerusalem. You cannot go to most synagogues or minyanim anywhere and not see some language about rebuilding Jerusalem in prayer books, prayer materials, even if some reform or conservative shuls have softened the language a bit more poetically over time. We got to think about this original source material and what our ancestors thought God would think and even rebuke about our fundamentally insular, even incorrect attitudes about our own destruction. And finally, I brought this source because of this. Mourning without some semblance of national responsibility, our Jewish national comeuppance, if you will, is a fundamental part of praising God. Thus, rebuilding Jerusalem is not an ethno-statist vanity project. No, its vision, derived from the rabbis of the Talmud, compels us to take a solemn and ironic look at ourselves and our spiraling griefs to build a better city and a more whole, holier nation. I want to ask you to look at this dirge. Let the words wash over you. Pull it up on your screens. And as you look at the verses, and this is not easy, I want to ask you to ask yourselves, what about the language is striking to you? Are you put off by the imagery? If we take a look at the first three lines, we read, when I recall women eating their own fruit or produce, the toddlers they raised with devotion, woe is me. When I recall compassionate women cooking their children, the ones who had been lovingly weighed bit by bit, woe is me. When I recall their hair braids, the hair braids of the women being torn away as they were tied to running horses, woe is me. So much woe. And as you hear the Rebbe poet Kalir's words, do you find yourself thinking, this must be hyperbole? How could it be possible and real that such devastation could exist? The image of the parent eating a child, unthinkable, repeats again and again, and yet we are faced with it. And here Kalir is masterfully weaving in multiple midrashim and pasukim, or verses from Tanakh. But do you find yourself thinking still like, no, this has to be imaginary, you know? Does the suffering he illustrates make you want to turn away? You know, maybe find another more pleasant poem. If you can for a moment, turn towards your looking away. What I mean is try to fathom the kind of society that engages in child sacrifice, the unthinkable, in which a parent's hunger supersedes, even defeats a child's fundamental need for safety and nourishment. And what, God forbid, of a Jewish community that sacrifices its children? Can we imagine it? And yet, so often our contemporary current conversations about Jewish heritage and Jewish place do not include the most displaced among us. The widow, the orphan, the people whose questions about their own Jewish belonging barely, if ever, make it to the tables of boardrooms, seats of sanctuaries, even the doors of walled buildings. Peacemaker John Paul Lederach once wrote the words, "We are living in a 200-year present." What does it mean Jewishly then, if the people chairing our organizations, organizing our events, writing the op-eds, the statements, everything, are the older adults with the bylines, the most powerful people in the most powerful rooms? And yet the words, "Benibu, benechem, uvenotechem, zichnechem." If the old are to dream dreams and the youth are to see visions, as the prophet Yoel suggests, the young are not meant to be devoured by ego by their elders. No, the young are meant by our tradition to be empowered, including the moral charge of many young Jews in Canada to end the occupation by directing our institutions towards principled acts that align with Palestinian and Israeli left's collaborative work to make heritage sites pluralistically and justly accessible for all people, not just Jews. And it's a telling bit of irony that this poet Kalir, the author of this dirge, superseded his teacher, as we're taught. And not much information is known on him, but we do know this fact. He superseded his teacher, Yanai. And how does Yanai respond to the threat to his power? He poisons Khalil out of jealousy or spite. You cannot make up a more instructive lesson than this. To unbreak Jerusalem, we must mend the holes in ourselves. If the sin of Tisha B'Av is sinat chinam, baseless hatred, then it is only through baseless love, ahavat chinam, that we can repair the rifts of our ancestors. In the second line of the poem, which recalls Echa Rabbah, chapter 2, verse 23, an imaginative telling of Lamentations, we read in Shlomo Buber's translation, a father dies, leaves a young son to his mother, and when the besieging army surrounds Jerusalem, the mother slaughters the son and eats them. The prophet Jeremiah laments, "Lord, consider, consider, to whom have you done thus? Shall the women eat their fruit, the children that are dangled in their hands?" And the Spirit of God retorts, "Shall the priest and the prophet be slain in the sanctuary of the Lord?" Referring to Zechariah, the son of Yehoiada. So what this second line is referring to, and there's a cross-stitching of sources here. The Spirit of God is saying that there was a priest prophet, ironically, killed for rebuking idolatry in the Beit HaMikdash. And what do the people that he's rebuked do? They slaughter the priest prophet and later they lie about it. And so God delivers the invading Aram's army into the land. The rest, as they say, is history. The dirge's last line, which I'm going to call you to, is the ultimate irony. After reading, woe is me, I'm suffering, we're suffering, all the sacrifice imagery, the poet Kalir makes clear that the Israelites refused to see the suffering wrought by their own hands. And even this week and in the months that preceded it, we've seen the headlines. Palestinians throw rocks at Israeli worshipers and Israeli police at the Temple Mount. Israel demolishes a Palestinian shop in Silwan, East Jerusalem, and disseminates discriminatory building permits. Jewish millennials have an entitlement problem when it comes to Israel-Palestine synagogue life, starting a Jewish family. We've all read the polemics. But the question is, according to this dirge, which shows up in source material for our prayers and for our lives, who among us is willing to cast aside the sackcloth and write a different line? May we never cease to make noise about any of this. Thank you.
Devon, thank you very much. We should say the blessing over Torah study if it were, if I knew it by heart. But regardless, thank you so much for bringing us some of the reflections that come from tradition.
I know it.
Thank you. Let's get right into Alon Arad. But I think Devon, you've done us a great spiritual moment of reflection to think about what our tradition says about this day. Some of the point that we're summoning for this connection, the bridge that we're building from a day, which I think it's easy to have this day reflects just about Jewish tragedy, as it certainly does with other in part. But there's also, like Devon has mentioned, a significant part of this day, which is about reflecting on what hatred or discrimination or inequality that we ourselves are a part of, what we contribute to. And so I think what spoke to us about this holiday as it deals with Jerusalem is this is a day when something bad happened in Jerusalem, and that our tradition has asked us to reflect how did we contribute to the bad things happening in Jerusalem. So as we look at Jerusalem today, a city divided, and certainly not a city of peace as we would like to imagine it. What is the Jewish connection to this city? What does it mean to have a Jewish connection? Meaning, what do we do with that knowledge? The fact that Jews lived there, what is its consequence in our imagination? And as Devon and others have already mentioned, that there are ways of unpacking a Jewish connection to a place that reinforce multiculturalism and tolerance and make space for others to be there with us, alongside us. And there's ways of interpreting the Jewish connection to Jerusalem or to Israel or to places where Jews have been that is exclusionary, intolerant, and contributes to ultranationalism. And that is part of the topic of what concerns us today in present-day Jerusalem, and why we've invited Alon Arad, who's the Executive Director of Emek Shaveh, join us and share from his work. How do they answer these questions, and what is being done? What are the things that can be done and are being done to push back on those exclusionary interpretations? So I'm delighted to welcome Alon Arad, the Executive Director of Emek Shaveh. He'll tell us a little bit more about Emek Shaveh, but Alon, by way of introduction, he's an archaeologist. He studied archaeology in Tel Aviv University. During his studies, he researched the early Bronze Age and focused on ancient urbanism and immigration. During the last few years, Alon has worked in a strategic consulting capacity, specializing in crisis management and conflict negotiation. Obviously handy if you're working in Jerusalem. In January of this year, Alon began as Emek Shaveh's director. He originally grew up in Tel Aviv. He's married to a physician. He's raising 2 daughters and a dog. Alon, welcome so much. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you, and thanks Devon for the reflection, which was very enlightening.
Let's dive in, Alon. Would you just maybe we can tell us a little bit more about where you come from, how you got started in this work. Just a little bit more about who you are.
Yeah. So okay. So you gave most of my bio already. I have to tell you though that, well, I grew up in a very political house. So politics and right, left were quite from any time I spent with my father mainly. And I think that up until university, I was what can be called in Israel a centralist, light, right, somewhere in between right and left. And I think that it was when I started studying archaeology and how heritage works in present day, which is what we're going to talk about, things have started to change. So this was kind of my way of understanding the situation here in a more a clear way, and to understand how there are many mechanisms. It's not just the horrible military violence, and it's not just a struggle over a point in the ground for settlements or houses. It's a much vast mechanism and much more complex. And I'm assuming that most of you have saw the report by Breaking the Silence about the civil administration. So this is kind of the most of the problems we deal with. It's bureaucracy. And we'll talk about later, I mean, how bureaucracy comes in here. But I think that archaeology for me was the way to see the reality in a different way here.
Was there a particular moment that was eye-opening for you, that the archaeological was connected to the political, or a turning point?
Actually it was. I think it was in the summer of 2013. I was excavating near the Sea of Galilee in a tel called Tel B'Av, for those of you who might know it. And the whole expedition was very political. All the staff were very involved with heritage and politics. And the professor, Rafi Greenberg, who's also one of the founders of Emek Shaveh, placed a bunch of these booklets from Emek Shaveh. And I started reading through that, and I was like, oh, wow, archaeology is much more than typology and stratigraphy and walls and baskets and dirt. It has huge meaning, and it's not just the interpretation. And I think this is the main thing I would like to talk about today. It's not just the interpretation. The interpretation is the last phase of archaeology. What I saw is the whole decision making before going there. Where do we excavate? Why do we excavate? How much do we excavate? Who can excavate initially? And this was the most eye-opening experience I had.
Well, let's get into that. Just a brief word about what is Emek Shaveh, and then let's get into it. So
yeah, sure. So Emek Shaveh. Okay, Emek Shaveh obviously is an NGO. We work to defend cultural heritage rights as part of human rights, and to protect ancient sites and historical sites as public assets that belong to all members of all communities, all faiths. We mainly work in this interaction between archaeology, heritage, and contemporary life, obviously. We look at the role of archaeology and heritage sites in the construction and design of historical narratives, and therefore their part in the political conflict that we have here. We use advocacy, report writing, we go out to the field, occasionally, sometimes, and we work with a lot of policymakers in Israel.
I think that will become a little bit more clear as you sort of unpack the issues. So yeah. I mean, I think which I know I can speak for a number of people in our audience. So like archaeology is something that we care a lot about. It's something that we are really like deeply connects us. The discoveries that come, still to this day, deeply connect us to some sense of like finding between like myths of our tradition that are really important, and also facts and like a concrete history that we can ground also in real life. That both of these things make a connection to Israel and to that place. I'm sure many people, are reading Haaretz, and every once in a while Haaretz has an article where they're covering actually debates from within the archaeological community, which, in case people don't know, like Emek Shaveh frequently crops up as the other side or the people arguing as part of the debate. So people may have seen your byline or have seen mention of Emek Shaveh but didn't realize it. That Emek Shaveh is like out there in the field, like actively working on these things. But let's go backwards one step. Like, we keep using this word heritage site. Like, what do you mean by heritage site? Like, what does it mean to have a heritage site today? Like, what are we talking about?
Okay, so actually, great question. So if we think, let's begin with numbers. So if you look upon the entire area, we have, let's say, approximately 100,000 sites, which are either archaeological, and here I have a footnote. Archaeology in Israel is defined by the year 1700. So what happened afterwards is historical sites, and before that are archaeological sites. But if we combine them together into this one huge pool of sites, it's approximately 100,000 sites. And we have to understand that
Israel proper, or Israel and the territory?
Between the Jordan and the Mediterranean, and between the Hermon Mountain and Eilat in the south and the Red Sea. The meaning or the implication of it is that if you think about this tiny piece of land with so many sites, that means that almost every settlement, it doesn't matter if it's Jewish, Palestinian, Druze, Bedouin, almost every settlement is either directly on or entangled with or nearby some sort of heritage sites. And therefore, we have to change our mindset and to think about these sites not as just places that froze in time and like the Pompeii, if anyone here knows, Pompeii was buried by a volcanic ash. These are living places that keeps on adding more and more traditions and more relations, and people work and live next to them and therefore relate to them in different ways. So for one hand, we can see mainly Jewish settlements. They have a lot of interest in archaeology. They have a lot of to do with it. They would like it to be developed. They can find their ancestry in there. That doesn't mean that every community around here views the sites as the same. For some, it might be agricultural plot. They don't want this place to be developed. Some view it as a religious site. Again, they don't want us archaeologists to go and dig around there. And we have to change our mindset here, because if we view archaeology and heritage in general as part of constructing our national identity or our national narrative, and this is, by the way, not something unique to Israel. It's something that happens all over the place. Almost every nation approached the past for a justification for ancestry. But we have to here, I think, to view these places as more complex, as places that can tell multiple stories, not just by different layers, just by different affiliation. Some can view it as the tomb of one person from the Bible, and another can see it as a sheikh. And I think that what means a heritage site today. And if we go to Jerusalem, obviously, which is our main topic here, and we look at the Haram el-Sharif, Temple Mount, and how this place changed and accumulated different constructions, but also different traditions, also different relationships. We cannot view it, I think, just as a place of one affiliation or one layer.
I mean, certainly when we look at, I think that you put it into a frame where we're looking at like all of Israel, and it's like, well, every inch is has some archaeological significance, and we're going to build a new, we're going to expand, living space for people, and so we're going to end up covering up a lot of stuff. But that's an issue for another day. As we look at Jerusalem, I think it's, you're sort of hinting at how complicated it is. But before we move along to, who's abusing heritage sites, what is the connection between, say, heritage sites and identity, and heritage sites that are contributing, what matters, what can be proven in the archaeological record is not necessarily its significance in, say, tradition or culture or heritage. So there are some places that are there are some parts of Israelis today, of Israeli society, that are really highlighting the Jewish connections and indeed potentially excluding all the other narratives. There were many societies that lived in Jerusalem, many rulers, many peoples. Jews did and didn't live in there at lots of different times. There's a long-going connection that we can and can't prove. What is the connection between heritage sites and ultranationalism?
So if we think about Jerusalem and how archaeology has been done in Jerusalem, starting from the 19th century, most of it was done in some way with connection to religion. I mean, obviously you cannot avoid it. But I think that in the past 25 years, there was a big shift and change in Jerusalem, because, as I said, archaeology and heritage has always been pivotal or some way to the Israeli national identity. But the thing is that in Jerusalem, and I think also in some way in the West Bank, but that is again for another talk, the concept of uniting the city brought a different motivation into heritage and archaeology. Because if you think about 1967, and in 1967, Israel conquered Jerusalem or liberated it, and they met the old city, which was mainly Palestinian, with a surrounding, which is also very Palestinian. You had all these villages that were later annexed, like Abu Tor, like Silwan, Atur, Wadi Joz, Sheikh Jarrah. They are all surrounding this place. Now, changing heritage sites, it's very complicated, because it's either you go and you pick one layer or pick one story and enlighten it, and this is what happens in the city of David, for example. But to change the core of this historical basin, which is the old city, and in its heart is the Temple Mount, Haram Sharif, is much more difficult. So you can change the story, and you can change the narrative, and you do it through heritage sites, and you do it through picking different sites to preserve or to highlight. You do it through picking one layer and even excavating only this one layer, if you think about the tunnels in the city of David. And then you create a map, because eventually what we do is that we create this mental or physical map with all these sites. And then when one thinks about the old city and the sites that it includes, or it travels the old city, or it looks upon the old city from outside, and he sees all these monuments, some of them are Jewish and some are not. But then if you go through a tour around and you visit only Jewish sites or Jewish heritage sites or Jewish site that has some affiliation to Jewish heritage, you get this notion, this feeling that it's only Jewish, that it should be only Jewish. And then comes in another layer, and this is the connection between, okay, and I think Tamara mentioned it, so we have a Jewish site. What does it mean? What does it mean that we have a Jewish site? Should we have ownership of it, over it? Should it be serving claims of sovereignty over this place? And for that, for me, I always think about sites in different countries. So we can think about the Colosseum in Italy. This is obviously an Italian heritage site. But if you go to history and you read Josephus Flavius, the construction was funded by the looted treasures of the temple. Should we claim ownership of that place? I mean, we paid for it partly. Okay. Should we claim ownership of it? And if you want to think on another example, which is a bit more radical, we can think about all the synagogues in Eastern Europe. Okay, they were abandoned during World War II. They have remained abandoned for many, many years. Should Israel claim ownership over them? And what happens when someone damages them? Should we send, I don't know, police, military to keep them? And when you think about that logic, and you think about, okay, so therefore, these sites cannot be signs of ownership. It cannot be on the basis of claims of ownership. We can have criticism about how they are managed. We should, as archaeological community, as Jewish community, but having, I think that's the point, having a site which is affiliated with any cultural identity does not mean it has to have something with ownership. And you know, I've been asked many times, are there Palestinian heritage sites? And it's a tricky question in a way, because you don't really have the Palestinians before, let's say, 100 years, more than 100 years ago, because there wasn't such a definition. But if we think about, if we are separating cultural affiliation from sovereignty or national claims over ground, then you have approximately, I know about 6,000 archaeological sites in the West Bank. So yeah, they are a Palestinian heritage site. So is the city of David. It can be a Palestinian heritage site with Jewish affiliation, the same way the Colosseum is an Italian heritage site. And the same way some of the synagogues are Polish or Hungarian heritage sites.
We'll get into into some concrete examples, and we'll unpack a little bit more about your David. Like what you're saying really resonates with me, because I remember, having been to Jerusalem a number of times, and of course having gone with Jewish organizations, groups, a birthright trip, and of course you get the Jewish tour of everything. So I've sort of, I'm sure many of us on the call have also been to Jerusalem a number of times and have gone through like that sort of standard tour of the old city at least a number of times. I think I've got at least 3. But I went out of my way purposefully at one time to make sure that I got like the basic Christian tour of the old city and the basic Muslim tour of the old city, and to sort of walk the exact same streets and to look at some of the exact same sites, but often it's just the site that's like right next to it. And to fully see sort of like at least partially unpacked all of the other pieces and layers that go in here. In a city, as it just makes you feel that Jerusalem is incredibly dense and that everything is on top of each other. So for me, what you're saying makes an awful lot of sense. What is the significance? What do we do with the knowledge that we have a connection to this place? I think that's I think the sort of reflection that you're inviting us to make is really befitting of Tisha B'Av. What is the significance of our connection to Jerusalem?
Yeah, I think also we have to separate here a little bit the religious or narrative aspect or our feelings towards, or the story we think about when we think about Jerusalem. And on the other side, there is this science called archaeology and science called history, and they're not always connecting with each other. Okay, so and for me, I don't mind having first, second, and third Jewish temples over Temple Mount, if you include the Hashmonite temple. So then the Herodian one is also the third, but we'll leave that for another debate. And I don't mind having King David as a historical figure, because it's so important, and we cannot leave it out when we criticize how heritage is being used or misused. And I don't even mind King David's palace to be where it is in the city of David. I think, though, that we have to separate between the story and the narrative and the religious aspects of it and the science of archaeology. And here comes the question of how it's being misused. Because scientifically saying, I can tell you that I was not convinced that what Eilat Mazar found in 2005, it is King David's palace. Because I think the stratigraphy was wrong. I feel, and I read, and I think now that she was wrong with her interpretation. Okay. And here comes the misuse, because when you think about ultra-nationalistic agenda and foundations that work to Judaize East Jerusalem and to create this notion that it belongs to us, they work in several levels. So there is the level of housing and houses acquisition and deportation and takeovers. But if you look from the overview upon what happens in East Jerusalem, I think the settlers movement in East Jerusalem was not very successful in changing demographics Not just recently, they're strengthening or putting more pressure on that. But their major success was to erode the green line separating between East and West Jerusalem by tourism and creating this wave of tourists. And you mentioned Birthright, but it's also the IDF that comes to visit in the city of David, and it is also high school pupils, and it's also huge amounts of groups, different groups that arrive there. And this is where archaeology is being misused, because when you go in and you visit these sites and you visit these places, you are given a story which is not necessarily accurate. And our response,
it's at the very least partial, like picking and choosing.
yes, and then you think, okay, so why do people like Elad Foundation needs archaeology in the beginning, in the first place? I mean, they have history written. Obviously, there is no archaeological find that I can find in excavations in the city of David that would either prove them wrong or right, by the way. Okay, so I cannot find any piece of pottery shard and they would say, oh, sorry guys, we were wrong. That's not history. There wasn't King David. It's not history.
Yeah,
so they need.
Let's make sure let's define our terms. Let's go backwards one quick step. You've mentioned Elad Foundation and Ir David, and now we're getting into who's abusing his heritage sites.
Yeah.
So you just I'm sure many people are familiar with the
okay, yeah,
archaeological site, tourist site. I think we're redefining it in East Jerusalem, just to the east in the valley,
to the south,
going down to the valley outside of the walls of the old city, known as Ir David, City of David. So, but it's actually, as many of us know and have followed in the news, it's like a settler front. But would you explain to us, like from an archaeologist perspective, like what are they doing and what's going on there?
Okay, yeah, thank you for taking me backwards a little bit. So the city of David is located on the southern slope from, if you go out from Dung Gate, so anyone who have visited Western Wall, you can go out through the Dung Gate, and then you go down to the neighborhood of Wadi Khilwe, which is part of Silwan. The city of David is actually located there. I mean, it is the ancient part, the most ancient part of Jerusalem. It is claimed that following the 2nd century rebellion in the Romans and the destruction of Jerusalem, eventually they constructed the whole city in a different location in order to disconnect it from its ancient roots. But this is actually the most ancient part of Jerusalem. And the city of the Elad Foundation, which stands for To the City of David, Elad, El Ir David. This is a foundation that was founded somewhere, I think, in the late 80s. They focused at the beginning on house acquisition from Palestinians and inhabiting Jewish families with various mechanisms, not just pure acquisitions or buying. And somewhere in the mid-90s, they understood that what I just said, that bringing one family at a time is just not enough to create this notion of ownership over this place. So they approached archaeology, which they knew it's there because it had been excavated for many years before that. And they started using archaeology in a way that is, from my opinion, highly cynical. Because on the one hand, they made it very accessible, and I believe that at least some of the people here took their visit in the city of David and went to the Chizkiyahu tunnel and walked with the water in the water there. It's very fun and it's very accessible and very easy. Oh, yeah, me too, by the way, with Birthright. So But in the meantime, during the whole visit there, you're being taught a very specific story of the place, and combining this very positive adventure you have and narrative, and the mediator here, and the one who turns the whole thing into, or give it authenticity in a way, is the archaeology. Because once you go in there and you see these little signs that tells you, be aware there are open holes here, be aware it's archaeological excavation, and you see the people walking there, you know, covered with dirt, picking up stuff. It gives the whole place authenticity, scientific authenticity. So it doesn't even matter, as I said, what they find in their excavations, as long they're there. And this is why I think it's very cynical, this misuse of heritage, because it's
just saying that they, just to fully unpack it for our listeners, like, are there archaeologists in there? Are they publishing papers? Are they presenting things that they find?
Yes, there are archaeologists from the Israeli Antiquity Authority, from Tel Aviv University, and I had a lot of conversation with these archaeologists because I told them, wait, you are being funded by this right-wing organization. Probably they'll try to influence your results, and probably they'll try to influence your interpretations. And they kept telling me, no, they don't interfere in anything. And it took me a while to understand that they're right. Maybe they don't, because yeah, they excavate and they publish their materials in all these journals that I'm sure no one's here is subscribed to. I mean, I'm not even subscribed to. All the Palestine Exploration Quarterly and others. And they talk in all these conferences, which happens somewhere. Most of them are not in Hebrew even. And they talk in this weird language of archaeologists. So this whole debate, it is brought to the public only by the signs that are in the site itself. And who controls the signs? The one who controls the sign controls the narrative. So if you go there, and I strongly recommend you in your next visit, this is, by the way, one of our most successful, I'm joking, struggles, is that when you go into the city of David and you go down the stairs and you stand above King David's palace and you look on the sign over there, it will write a large stone structure, King David's palace, and the question mark. The question mark is a project of Emek Shaveh. So we insisted of them at least bring some of the academic debate somehow into the public.
So what you're saying is that there's archaeologists can say what they want because it's a primarily like academic affair with a developed like scientific language, like it's the translators of that work who bring their work to the public. And if I think, as you said before, the sort of archaeological priority paid for by the government already or by a seller organization is to like find the Jewish stuff and highlight the Jewish stuff, and please dig here where we think there is a Jewish thing. Of course, that's like already erasing so much of everything. And then on top of that, there's the additional translation by the sort of tourist industry, the in this case, it's the tourist industry, but it's not the tourist industry at large. It's this agency, this organization that wants to portray an exclusive Jewish narrative. So of course, what may have been a bias in the field becomes quite explicit in their presentation to tens of thousands of Israeli visitors. And then you said it's cynical, it's purposeful. They're doing this because it's a tool available to do the work that they want to do, which is not necessarily furthering truth and Jewish history as much as it is furthering an ultra-nationalist objective. It's a tactic for the development of Jerusalem as the settler movement wants to see it.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, okay, so we have the state.
Alon, let's but let's because I want to open it
We're
up
short of time.
for Q&A. Yeah. I think you'll get a chance because I'd like to move to Q&A. I know that it's at the hour. We are recording this, so if folks need to get going, you're welcome to get going, and you'll get the rest of the recording. But let's move to Q&A at this point. So at least for those of you who want to stick around for another 10 or 15 minutes, we can ask Alon to dig a little bit deeper and answer our questions. I see if you have a question, drop it into the chat. You can also raise your hand using the little raise hand button, which is underneath the button on Zoom. It says reactions, a little smiley face with a plus sign, and you can hit the raise hand button just like Jackie and Schwartz has done. So what I'd like to do is to take 3 questions at once, if we could. So Jackie, I see you've already unmuted. Go ahead, ask your question, then we'll take a couple.
Okay, I was at the City of David with a bunch of travel writers who knew nothing about Israel and knew nothing about, I mean, if you'd mentioned Sheldon Adelson to them, they would have seen it and seen the name in terms of his support for the right wing in the US, but nothing like that. Anyway, they had a very, very upbeat guide. He talked about sports in the US and charmed the group. Again, the group knew nothing. I pointed out the city of Silwan and said, well, what's that? And the guide said, oh, well, Yemenite Jews used to live there. So from the soft music outside the City of David, I'm sure you're familiar with that. To me, it was very, very offensive. And unfortunately, people in tourism, for the most part, are gonna just buy it hook, line, and sinker. So, I mean, that's very important too, because then they influence tourists. And to me, archaeology in Israel is just being weaponized.
I think I've got a question out of what Jack.
That's not a question.
That's not a question, but I think I've got one for you, Alon.
Okay.
Alon, what is being done about tour guides? I mean, Jacqueline, you raised something that's actually really good and productive that we didn't have time to get to yet. Is it okay if I move on, Jacqueline? Thank you for sharing, because I think it was a great example. Okay, and I see a second question. I don't see your name. I see. You want to unmute yourself, sir? CSL Men Club. Harold. Hi, Harold. Go ahead. You want to unmute yourself and ask?
Okay. I'm coming from a totally different position. I'm listening to both sides, what the Arabs say, what your speakers are saying. And I think I'm sorry to say, a little bit naive. If you want to find a solution, you have to find something that'll be acceptable to both sides. And I don't think that's going to be possible. Because the Arabs have been teaching their youngsters generation after generation, from the ocean, from the sea, from the river to the sea, they want Israel, and all of Israel, and want Israel to disappear and all the Jews to be out. That's not a possible solution.
Is there a version of that that's a question for Alon?
Yeah, what can be done? What kind of a solution could be acceptable, because all types of compromises seem to be impossible. Neither side is going to be willing to give up a little bit, except the middle of the road, who don't seem to have the power. The ones who are doing all the yelling and screaming are the extremists on both sides. Please give me your answer to that.
Thanks, Harold. I see a question from Gabriella as well, Gabriella Gallagher. I did see your question in the chat, Gabriella.
Okay, well, it's the same question.
Go ahead.
Okay, I just, I wonder if Alon could speak a little bit about, yeah, I should show my face, could speak a little bit about what is actually happening on the ground in some of these all these tours coming, and how that disrupts the life of Palestinians in the area, in the neighborhood.
Great questions.
Okay, so
Alon, I don't think you have to answer for all Palestinians. I certainly don't think that we believe that they are all one,
no,
opinion. I would like you to, perhaps opine. There's a couple questions here who've been about like, there is a Jewish side to this, but there's also a Palestinian side to this. Like, is there any work that you do connected? How do you see that part of it?
So for the first question about the tour guides, yeah, we do have, let's say, problem with how tour guides are being educated. We have problem with how archaeologists are being educated in Israel. I mean, if you think about bias in university, I had many courses about the Iron Age, which is the biblical times, if you compare it. And I didn't had many courses about early Bronze Age. Actually, I had one, which I fell in love with. So there are biases here, and there are biases in our education system and how we teach our high school kids about what happened between the moment Jews were expelled from the Holy Land and then came back in 1948 or in the late 19th century. So we have here 2,000 years that, if I can quote or disprove the quote of Naomi Shemer, we have not returned to the empty water cisterns and the empty marketplaces in Jerusalem. There were people around here, and we are actually working into changing that. So you can find tour guides that we are producing, and lectures that we give, and talks like these with all audiences that we try to influence on to tell a more complex story, and to show people that when they arrive to the city of David, it is arriving Silwan, basically. For the second question of Harold, well, unfortunately, I'm not in a position yet to negotiate for both parties at the moment. Maybe in the future, maybe, I don't know. I don't have any political aspirations at the moment. But look, I'm responsible for the Israeli side. I cannot talk in favor or against Palestinians and how they teach their kids what to do and what not to do. It's not my responsibility. My responsibility, and we're talking on Tisha B'Av, which is a look towards our inner Jewish community, and to think what I can do among Israelis to change their perspective, to be more respectful for different heritage, and maybe through that to bring peace. I mean, I cannot control over Palestinian educational system, and I don't want to criticize it, because obviously, I mean, it's not like I'm not criticizing American or Canadian or French educational systems. It's different people, and it's their own decision. If it is helpful or not for a peace process, obviously not. And the last question about how archaeology is being disrupting Palestinian life. Well, archaeology, if you think about what we do is archaeology. So basically, we get a piece of land in custody from the state. So we get a permit, and that is by law. So to do excavation, I have to get a permit. And once I get this permit, I basically get this piece of land in my custody, and I can do almost everything I want to do. But the most important thing is that I change this place. So if I take a parking lot like Givati parking lot in the city of David, and I turn it into an archaeological site, and then I emphasize Jewish heritage there, then I have just both disrupted dramatically life, because I took property out of people, or out of the public in that matter, and I changed it, and I turned into something that is undermining them. And I told you that there are so many sites here. And when you think about, if you have to have development plans or city planning over archaeological sites, and you don't allow it to Palestinians through or by archaeological claims, you disrupt life in a much vaster way. I hope this answers all questions.
I wish that we had time for more questions or even a give and take, but I want to draw it to a close here. I think the theme that we're seeing with Alon's work and the questions that he's asking are, what is Jewish responsibility in Jerusalem in this conflict? I think we like to imagine that Israel's actions are benevolent or benign and are not part of a cycle of violence which is mutually reinforcing. But I think we can see, especially last May, where the actions of extremists in East Jerusalem, Minister of Knesset Itamar Ben-Gvir setting up shop in a high-intensity neighborhood where families were being dispossessed by the actions of the settler movement, in cooperation with the Israeli government and the Jerusalem municipality, that these things stoked tensions and had a part of the responsibility for why rockets fell from the skies on both Israelis and Palestinians. We have a part in this to play. And I think the holiday of Tisha B'Av really acts as to reflect on the exercise of Jewish power and the responsibility that it comes on us as diaspora supporters of Israel, as those who give our shekels to good things in Israel. Are we reflecting on our part in this? Are we actively contributing to Israelis like Alon, like Emek Shaveh, like Tag Meir, like Shalom Achshav, like Arza Canada, who are supporting things in Israel that support, quite frankly, the good guys, the people who are trying to trying to push back on ultranationalism, on religious extremism, on a vision of Israel which is Jewish extremist, Jewish exclusivist, Jewish only. And that is, I think, the uniting set of values that all of us share. Thanks again to Alon for sharing what you've shared. Thank you to Devon for teaching. Thank you to Arza and to Canadian Friends of Shalom Achshav for joining this presentation. Thank you to our third co-sponsor, Shari Bethel of Halton. We really appreciate this. We wish you, Tisha B'Av may be already over, but please, we invite you to reflect on how you're taking action to support Israelis in Israel that are making Jerusalem a more multicultural, a more peaceful, and more shared place for everyone who lives there and everyone around the world who also has a connection to it. So thank you very much. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you, Hannah, for organizing that.
Pleasure. Bye.